The billionaire CEO sneered, kicking the rusted shell of a car a single dad had brought to his luxury auto shop, ordering him to throw the garbage away. 3 days later, the CEO's jaw hit the floor when an F1 racing legend landed a helicopter in the lot, offering $15 million for that exact pile of rust. Stay until the very end, because the 7-year-old girl's payback line is absolutely savage. The air inside Vance Elite Motors did not smell like a garage. It smelled of industrial-grade ozone filters, expensive Italian leather, and the chilling, sterile scent of absolute power. The floor was a sea of mirror-polished black marble, so clean that if you looked down, you saw your own reflection, distorted, small, and insignificant, as if the building itself was designed to remind you of your place in the social hierarchy. Under the cold, surgical glare of thousands of recessed LED spotlights, supercars sat like predators in a museum. Their paint jobs were so deep they looked like pools of liquid obsidian and ruby. Julian Vance stood in the center of this cathedral of ego, adjusting his 24-karat gold cufflinks. At 45, he was the personification of the elite. He wore a 3-piece Tom Ford suit that cost more than a master mechanic's annual salary. His hair was slicked back with a precision that suggested he viewed even a single stray strand as a personal moral failure. Julian measured human worth entirely by net worth. To him, the world was divided into 2 distinct groups: those who were the architects of the future and those who were merely the dust gathered in its corners. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the morning was gray and oppressive. A rusted 2008 pickup truck, its engine coughing a rhythmic metallic protest, groaned to a halt at the perimeter. It exhaled a thick cloud of gray diesel smoke that momentarily blurred the pristine view of the city's skyline. Julian's jaw tightened, a tiny, involuntary spasm of irritation. Arthur Sterling stepped out of the truck. He was 38 years old, but the silver creeping through his temples and the deep trenches around his eyes suggested a man who had lived through a century of storms. He wore a faded gray jumpsuit, stained at the cuffs with engine oil that no chemical soap could ever truly lift. His hands were his most striking feature, thick at the knuckles, calloused at the palms, and scarred with the history of 1,000 machines. He didn't walk with the hurried desperation of a beggar. He moved with an unhurried, heavy-footed grace. Beside him, clutching the hand of a worn-out stuffed bear with one ear missing, was Maya. She was 7 years old, wearing a pink jacket with a small, careful patch on the elbow. Her eyes, wide and amber, inherited her father's quiet, analytical intensity. As they approached the heavy glass doors, the security guards hesitated. They looked at the truck, then at Arthur's boots, then at Julian's face. Julian gave a single, microscopic nod of permission. He wanted an audience for his morning coffee. He wanted to feel the weight of his own pedestal. Arthur pushed the door open. The silence of the showroom swallowed the sound of his boots. He stopped 10 feet from Julian. "I told the security guards that we weren't accepting deliveries of scrap metal today," Julian said. His voice was a smooth, disruptive baritone that carried the chill of a winter morning. He didn't look at Arthur's face. He only looked at a smudge of grease on Arthur's collar. The smirk on Julian's face was a permanent fixture of his condescension. "I'm not here to deliver anything, Mr. Vance," Arthur said. His voice was low, stable, and carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate from deep within his chest. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly what he was standing on. "I found a chassis in a collapsed storage unit at the old shipyard. I need to use your laser alignment scanner to verify the suspension geometry. I believe it has historical significance." Julian let out a dry, theatrical laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. He walked toward the windows and peered at the back of Arthur's truck. Under a torn canvas tarp sat a twisted, orange-brown skeleton of a car. It looked like a corpse that had been fished out of the bottom of the ocean. "Historical significance?" Julian repeated, his lip curling in disdain. "Sterling, the only history that pile of iron has is with the nearest industrial shredder." He walked out to the parking lot, his designer shoes clicking sharply against the asphalt. He reached the truck, and with a violent, sweeping motion, he kicked the metal frame. Clang! A heavy flake of rust broke off and fluttered into the dirt. Julian pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the toe of his crocodile leather shoe as if he had just touched something infected. "Take that junk to the scrapyard, Sterling," Julian hissed. "It's garbage, a $100 pile of scrap that's making my showroom look like a landfill. Get out before I call the police for illegal dumping." Maya stepped forward, her small frame shielding the rusty metal. She looked up at the billionaire, her amber eyes burning. "My daddy says inside this car is a sleeping legend," she said, her voice clear and chillingly calm. "You just can't hear it because you're too busy listening to the sound of your own voice." Julian froze. The smile instantly evaporated from his face. His eyes went slightly red at the corners. He looked at the child, then at the man in the jumpsuit. He realized that Arthur Sterling had something he could never buy, the absolute unwavering faith of someone who saw him as a king, even when he was covered in dirt. "I'll give you a receipt, Sterling," Julian said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I'll sign it myself, a formal rejection of appraisal. It will state that this is officially worthless industrial waste. That way, when you try to abandon it on a street corner, the city will know it's not my responsibility. Sign it, take your trash, and get out of my sight." Arthur didn't flinch. He took the clipboard. He signed his name with a steady hand. "Thank you for the receipt, Julian," Arthur said quietly. "You should keep your copy. It's going to be the most expensive piece of paper you ever signed." The drive back to the industrial outskirts was a journey through the cooling veins of a dying city. The high rises of glass and steel gave way to boarded-up brick warehouses and rusted chain-link fences. Arthur Sterling's workshop sat at the very end of a dead-end street, a narrow slice of concrete and corrugated iron that smelled perpetually of old kerosene and rain-soaked wood. Inside, the shadows were long and heavy. Arthur sat on a plastic crate, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't turn on the lights. He let the dim gray afternoon filter through the cracked skylight. The narrator, observing the silence of the room, knew the history etched into the marrow of Arthur's bones. 5 years ago, Arthur didn't live in a graveyard of machines. He had been the lead technical architect for one of the most prestigious Formula One teams in Europe. He was the man who spoke to engines in a language of vibrations and heat signatures. He had a penthouse in London, a beautiful wife named Claire, and a future that looked as bright as a finishing line under the sun. Then came the Monaco Grand Prix, a steering failure, a catastrophic crash. The team needed a scapegoat to protect their insurance premiums and their billionaire sponsors. They fabricated a report claiming Arthur had bypassed safety protocols to save weight in the steering column. Overnight, his name became a curse in the racing world. His license was revoked. His assets were frozen by a mountain of lawsuits. 6 months later, Claire had died, not from the crash, but from the slow, agonizing erosion of hope and a medical bill that Arthur could no longer pay. He had buried her in a simple grave and moved to the only place that would have him, the shadows of the scrap industry. "Daddy?" Maya's voice broke the stillness. She was standing by the back of the truck, her small hand stroking the rough canvas tarp covering the rusted shell. "Why was that man so angry at the car? It hasn't done anything to him." Arthur stood up, the old ache in his lower back a reminder of the thousands of hours he had spent hunched over workbenches. He walked to her and placed a large hand on her shoulder. "He isn't angry at the car, Firefly," Arthur said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "He's angry that it doesn't have a price tag he can understand. People like Julian think that if something isn't shiny, it doesn't have a soul. But they're wrong. The soul is the only part that doesn't rust." He grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled. The twisted orange-brown skeleton was revealed. To any other eye, it was a mess of tubular steel and oxidized iron, but Arthur saw the geometry. He saw the specific hand-laid welds of a master craftsman. He saw the ghost of 1962. "We have work to do," he said. "Get the wire brushes and the degreaser. This is going to be a long night." The 3 nights that followed were a symphony of manual labor and technical obsession. Inside the drafty garage, Arthur worked in a pool of yellow halogen light that made the dust motes dance like miniature stars. The air grew thick with the scent of high-grade solvent, the sharp, acidic tang of rust converter, and the heavy metallic smell of iron that had been sleeping for over half a century. Arthur moved with the delicacy of a clockmaker. He didn't use power tools. They were too violent, too impatient for a body this fragile. He used his hands, the calloused, scarred fingers that had once been insured for millions of dollars. He used fine grit sandpaper and toothbrushes soaked in a solution of vinegar and lemon juice, a trick he'd learned from an old mechanic in Maranello 30 years ago. Maya sat on her stool, her small arm steady as she held the work light. She was his navigator in the dark. She watched as her father meticulously stripped away decades of neglect, revealing the silver-gray steel hidden beneath the orange wrought. She saw the way his jaws set in a line of iron. She saw the sweat bead on his forehead and the way his hands stayed perfectly still, even when the temperature in the garage dropped below freezing. For Arthur, this wasn't just a car. Every inch of metal he cleaned was a year of his own life he was trying to reclaim. He was scraping away the lies that had been told about him. On the second night, at 3:14 a.m., the miracle occurred. Arthur was working on the base of the tubular frame, near the mounting point for the steering column. He applied a final wipe of degreaser to a flat section of the metal. His hand froze. He leaned in, his breath hitching in his chest. He took a magnifying glass from his pocket, his heart hammering against his ribs like a piston. Beneath the last layer of solidified oil, a sequence of stamped numbers and a small, rearing horse emblem began to emerge. 250 GTO, chassis, U0385. Arthur's knees hit the concrete floor with a heavy, hollow thud. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat bobbed as he swallowed a lump of pure, unadulterated shock. This was the lost GTO, the car that had won the 1962 Targa Florio and then vanished into a private collection in Lyon. During the riots of the late 60s, the collection had been looted and the warehouse burned to the ground. The world believed 10385 had been melted down into rebar decades ago. But it hadn't. It had been sold as a parts frame to a scrap dealer in New Jersey, and then forgotten in a shipping container for 50 years before ending up in a collapsed shipyard in Detroit. Arthur looked at Maya. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the golden glow of the halogen lamp against the now shining steel. "Is the legend awake, Daddy?" she whispered, sensing the gravity of the moment. Arthur reached out and touched the metal. It was no longer cold. It felt alive, vibrating with a history that money couldn't buy. "She's awake, Firefly," Arthur whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the grease on his cheek. "And she's going to make sure that man in the white suit never forgets our name." He stood up and walked to his old, battered laptop. He didn't go to a public site. He accessed an encrypted forum, a digital gathering place for the world's top 5 automotive collectors. He didn't ask for a price. He didn't write a long story. He simply uploaded a single, high-resolution photo of the chassis stamp and the horse emblem, along with the GPS coordinates of his scrapyard. "Found," he typed. Then he closed the laptop and went back to work. He had 36 hours before the storm arrived. The world of high-stakes automotive collecting does not operate on public news cycles. It operates on whispers that move through encrypted servers and private phone calls made in the back of armored sedans. When Arthur Sterling typed that single word, "found," and uploaded the image of chassis Romeo 385, he didn't just send a message. He triggered a seismic event that began to rattle the foundations of the industry's most powerful institutions. 6,000 miles away, in a villa overlooking Lake Como, a billionaire collector dropped his glass of vintage Bordeaux. In a high-rise in Tokyo, a hedge fund manager canceled his afternoon meetings. And in the center of Detroit, on the top floor of the Vance building, the vibration finally reached the desk of Julian Vance. Julian sat in his executive chair, the leather creaking under his weight, as he stared at the glowing monitor of his workstation. He was a member of that elite forum. He had paid a $50,000 entrance fee just for the right to look at the posts. He had been looking for a 250 GTO for 3 years to serve as the centerpiece of his personal museum. It was the only thing that could validate his claim to being the king of the automotive world. He clicked on the thumbnail. The image expanded. It was high resolution, captured under a harsh halogen light. He saw the tubular frame, cleaned to a surgical gray. He saw the stamp. He saw the rearing horse. And then, his gaze drifted to the background of the photo. He recognized the floor. He recognized the specific, jagged crack in the concrete near the rear tires. He recognized the rusted leg of a red tool chest in the corner of the frame. A drop of cold sweat broke from Julian's hairline and traced a slow, agonizing path down his temple. His breathing hitched, becoming shallow and jagged. He stood up so quickly his chair slammed against the floor-to-ceiling glass window behind him. He walked to the window and looked down at the city, his eyes searching the horizon for the industrial district he had visited 3 days ago. "No," he whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "It's not possible. That was junk. It was a $100 pile of scrap." He lunged for his desk phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed his chief of security. "Get the lead attorney." "Now!" Julian roared into the receiver. "And get the Maybach ready. We are going back to the scrapyard. And tell the legal team to find a way to nullify a receipt. I don't care what it costs. I want that car back in my building before the sun sets." The narrator, watching from the high, sterile corners of the office, saw the mask of the elite CEO begin to crumble. Julian Vance was a man who believed that if you had enough money, the truth was whatever you decided it should be. He didn't realize that he had already signed away the only thing his money couldn't replace. He had signed a document that defined his own blindness. The morning of the third day did not begin with the sound of the city waking up. It began with a frequency that vibrated in the marrow of the bone, a deep rhythmic thump, thump, thump of high-end aeronautics. Maya was the first to hear it. She was standing in the center of the garage, holding a thermos of coffee for her father. She looked up at the skylight, her eyes widening as a shadow eclipsed the gray morning sun. "Daddy," she said, her voice filled with a strange, calm awe. "The metal isn't singing anymore. It's screaming." Arthur walked to the door of the garage and pushed it open. The wind from the rotors hit him like a physical blow, whipping his salt and pepper hair across his face. He squinted into the glare. A sleek, matte black Augusta Westland AW-109 helicopter, bearing the gold and red crest of Heritage Racing, was hovering 60 feet above the vacant lot directly across from the scrapyard. It was a machine that cost more than the entire street Arthur lived on. With terrifying precision, the pilot lowered the craft onto the cracked asphalt, sending a storm of gray dust and discarded plastic bags swirling through the air. As the rotors began to slow, a black Mercedes-Benz Maybach skidded to a halt at the edge of the lot. Julian Vance stepped out before the driver could even open the door. He was wearing a fresh white Tom Ford suit, but he looked like a man who had been running for miles. His hair was disheveled, and the ironclad coldness of his eyes had been replaced by a frantic, predatory greed. Behind him, 3 men in charcoal suits, his legal team, stepped out, clutching leather briefcases like shields. Arthur didn't move. He didn't adjust his jumpsuit. He didn't wipe the grease from his hands. He stood in the doorway of his humble sanctuary, his frame silhouetted against the silver-gray light of the resurrected Ferrari. He looked like a man who had already won a war that the others were just beginning to fight. The door of the helicopter slid open. Jean-Pierre stepped out. He was 72 years old, his face a map of legendary victories at Monza, Silverstone, and Le Mans. He was the Grand Duke of Speed, a man who had dined with kings and outrun death on every continent. He was wearing a racing jacket from 1965, the leather cracked and smelling of history. He carried a silver-headed cane, but he walked with a pace that suggested he could still handle a 300-horsepower engine. Julian Vance lunged forward, his designer shoes crunching on the gravel as he tried to reclaim the ground. "Monsieur Jean-Pierre!" Julian shouted, his voice high and brittle, the sound of a man trying to play a role he no longer occupied. "1,000 apologies for the environment. There has been a massive misunderstanding. This technician, Mr. Sterling, is a former associate of mine. He was tasked with a preliminary forensic cleaning of a Vance Elite asset. There was a clerical error in the processing paperwork." Julian turned to Arthur, his eyes red at the corners, a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated desperation. "Sterling, don't say a word. My lawyers are here to settle the processing fee." We'll take the chassis now. We have a flatbed coming." Arthur Sterling didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the Maybach. He looked directly into the eyes of Jean-Pierre. "The chassis is cleaned, monsieur," Arthur said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried over the dying whine of the helicopter engines. "The suspension geometry is verified. She is perfectly straight, exactly as she was the day you crashed her in the rain at the Targa Florio." The lot went into a suffocating, heavy silence. Jean-Pierre stopped 3 feet from Arthur. He looked at the grease on Arthur's hands, then at the man's face. A slow, profound recognition dawned in the legend's eyes. "Arthur Sterling?" Jean-Pierre whispered, his voice cracking. "The lead architect from the Monaco team? They told me you had vanished. They told me you were deficient." "I was just performing maintenance, monsieur," Arthur replied quietly. "In the shadows." Jean-Pierre turned his head slowly to look at Julian Vance. The racing legend's eyes were no longer wet with reverence. They were as cold as a winter night in the Alps. "A clerical error. Julian?" Jean-Pierre asked, his voice dripping with a disappointment that felt like a death sentence. "I have seen the post on the private network. I have seen the alignment data. This car does not belong to a showroom that kicks metal and calls it garbage." Jean-Pierre turned back to Arthur and Maya. He reached out and touched the tubular steel of the 250 GTO with a hand that had held the steering wheel of the same machine 60 years ago. "I have $15 million in a dedicated heritage fund," Jean-Pierre stated, his voice projecting to the edge of the lot where the reporters were now gathering. "I will buy this chassis today exactly as it stands. Arthur Sterling, I believe you are the owner of record?" Julian Vance lunged forward, grabbing the arm of his lead attorney. "Show him the receipt. Show him the processing signature. It was in my building. It was touched by my staff." Arthur Sterling didn't answer with words. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single crumpled sheet of paper, the original junk receipt. "Do you remember this, Julian?" Arthur asked. "Your signature, your official designation. You called this car worthless industrial waste. You kicked its frame and told us to take our defective dreams and get out of your sight." Julian's face went a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He looked at the paper, then at the cameras, then at the board of directors of his own company who were now pulling their cars into the lot, their faces filled with the practiced neutrality of people preparing to fire a CEO. The higher the tower, Arthur thought, the louder the crash. The silence in the scrapyard was no longer the silence of rust and industrial decay. It was the heavy, airless silence of a high courtroom just seconds before a life-altering verdict is read. The wind from the slowing helicopter blades died down, leaving only the sharp, metallic tink-tink-tink of the AW-109's cooling engines and the distant, rhythmic thud of the city's heart. Julian Vance's lead attorney, a man named Miller, who was paid $1,000 an hour to make the truth inconvenient, stepped forward. He reached for the paper in Arthur's hand, but Arthur pulled it back, a micro-expression of cold amusement crossing his rugged face. "Mr. Sterling," Miller began, his voice a rehearsed wall of legal authority, "a receipt signed under duress or within the context of a misidentified asset is not a legally binding transfer of title. My client was led to believe this was a different object. We will be filing an immediate injunction to freeze all activity on this site." Jean-Pierre let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a backfire from a high-performance engine. He stepped between the lawyer and Arthur, his silver-headed cane planting firmly into the cracked asphalt. "Misidentified?" Jean-Pierre asked, his eyes narrowing until they were like 2 chips of alpine ice. "I am not a lawyer, Monsieur Miller. I am a driver. In racing, if you misidentify a corner, you hit the wall. You do not get to ask for the track to be moved after the crash." Jean-Pierre turned his gaze back to Julian Vance, who was currently hyperventilating, his expensive Tom Ford suit now flecked with the gray soot of the very lot he had mocked. "Julian," Jean-Pierre said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal pitch. "You are the head of an elite automotive group. You have the best scanners, the best databases, and the best experts. And yet, you stood 3 feet from a 250 GTO and saw only industrial waste. You did not fail because of a clerical error. You failed because you are a man who measures the world by the shine on the shoes rather than the strength of the steel. Julian's jaw tightened, a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He looked at the board members of Vance Elite Motors, who were now standing in a phalanx at the edge of the lot, their arms crossed, their faces masks of icy corporate judgment. He realized that this lot was currently being live-streamed. His arrogance wasn't just a private mistake, it was a global liability. "Arthur," Julian choked out, the words sounding like it was being pulled through a throat full of glass. I can fix this. 20 million. I'll double the offer. I'll make you the executive technical director of the entire Vance Group. I'll reinstate your license. Just give me the receipt. Tell the cameras we were partners." Arthur Sterling looked at the man who had kicked his car 3 days ago. He looked at the man who had helped fabricate the report that killed his career and broke his wife's heart. He felt the weight of the last 5 years of darkness, the cold nights, and the smell of kerosene. "You can't buy back the years you stole, Julian," Arthur said, his voice stable and resonant. "And you certainly can't buy a soul you don't believe exists. You officially designated this car as garbage. And as a man of my word, I'm going to make sure it stays exactly that way. For you." The crowd of reporters pressed closer, their lenses catching the orange glow of the rising sun reflecting off the silver-gray frame of the Ferrari. This was the moment the world had been waiting for, the final collapse of the Tower of Glass. Maya stepped out from behind her father's broad shoulders. She had discarded her pink raincoat, revealing a clean white cotton dress that looked like a flag of truce in the middle of a war zone. She walked slowly toward Julian Vance, her small sneakers stopping exactly 1 inch from his polished, mud-splattered crocodile leather shoes. She looked at him straight in his cold, blue eyes. She didn't look like a frightened child. She looked like a judge. The narrator, watching the scene from the shadows of the garage, saw the geometry of the universe shift. The power was no longer in the skyscrapers or the Maybachs. It was in the hands of a 7-year-old girl holding a piece of paper. "Mr. Vance," Maya said, her voice high, clear, and chillingly calm. "My daddy told me that rust is just the world's way of testing how much you really care about what's underneath." She looked down at his shoes, then back at his face, her amber eyes burning with a savage, quiet intensity. "You told us to take this junk to the scrapyard," she whispered, the words landing like a heavy gavel in a silent courtroom. "But today, everyone can see that you're the only thing here that doesn't have a heart. You should leave now. You're making the air smell like a failure." A collective gasp moved through the reporters. Jean-Pierre placed a large, leather-gloved hand on Maya's shoulder, a gesture of absolute protection. "The lady has spoken," Jean-Pierre stated, his voice echoing across the lot. "Julian, your presence is an insult to the history of this machine. If you are not gone in 60 seconds, I will ensure that every bank in Europe knows exactly how you treat a legend." Julian Vance didn't speak. He couldn't. His composure had evaporated, leaving behind only the shivering remains of a man who had realized that weightless profit was merely another word for rootless survival. He turned and stumbled back into his Maybach, the black door closing with a sound that signaled the end of his empire. As the car skidded out of the lot, the board of directors followed in their own vehicles, leaving the junk man and the racing god alone with the $15 million ghost. 6 months later, the industrial district of Detroit didn't look the same. The gray fog was still there, but it no longer smelled of desperation. The narrow street where Arthur's garage once sat was now the entrance to a sprawling 3-block campus of brick and glass. The old abandoned factories had been gutted and reborn as the Claire Sterling Technical Academy. It was not a school for the elite. It was a sanctuary for the invisible. Here, children from the shadows were taught how to listen to engines, how to understand the geometry of steel, and how to look past the surface of things. They were taught that a man's worth is measured by the integrity of his work, not the designer label on his suit. Arthur Sterling stood in the center of the main workshop, no longer wearing a faded jumpsuit. He wore a clean, dark shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the same calloused, steady hands. He was no longer a ghost. He was the sun around which a new generation of creators orbited. Beside him, the Ferrari 250 GTO chassis Ferrari 385 was no longer a skeleton. She had been fully restored, her bodywork a deep, haunting shade of midnight blue that looked like the sky just before dawn. She wasn't in a museum. She was sitting on the floor of the school, her engine block exposed so that the students could see the heart that Julian Vance had called garbage. Maya sat on a wooden bench nearby, working on a scale model of a suspension system. She no longer wore patches on her elbows. She looked up at her father and smiled, a complete, uncomplicated smile that money could never have manufactured. "Daddy," she said, her voice sounding like a bell in the vast room, "is the legend happy now?" Arthur looked at the car, then at his daughter, then at the photo of Claire that sat in a small silver frame on his desk. He felt the weight of the last decade finally dissolve into the air, replaced by a quiet, steady peace that felt like a finishing line. "The legend is home, Firefly," Arthur replied softly, "and so are we." True power is not the ability to kick a rusted shell or command a boardroom. True power is the quiet competence to recognize value where others see only waste. It is the character to mend what others break. And it is the love of a father who knows that the most important engine in the universe is the one that keeps the truth moving forward. In the end, the symphony of rust had ended, and a new song had begun, a song of steel, soul, and the grace to never judge a book by its cover.